So here we are, picking up where we left off. So where we've left off is that the U.S. has now won the Spanish-American War. We've gone through a couple years of, what are we going to do with these places? How are we going to integrate them? And so we see that this kind of refers to the Philippines and the casualties and kind of the difficult treatment within the Philippines. And notice that, and I mentioned some of this in the last slide, that Aguinaldo and his rebels fight for 3 years, and we have a lot of brutal treatment in concentration camps. Taft will come in and fix it, and it's not until 1946, after World War II, that the Philippines gain their independence. So that's why the Philippines have a very strong kind of American connection. Puerto Rico, the Four-Acre Act of 1900 puts an appointed governor in charge, limits representation, does give Puerto Rico tariff protections, but it kind of creates this perception of second-class citizenship for Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico is a territory of the U.S., so they do still kind of have a bizarre relationship with us. So just kind of know that we didn't necessarily treat Puerto Rico very fairly. The Four-Acre Act, that is a distant relative of mine. My three greats maybe, uncle was Joseph Four-Acre, who was a senator. It's his name on this piece of legislation, woohoo. He was your classic party machine Republican, kind of the old guard. He was still a radical Republican when radical Republicans were way outdated. He was known as a really good speaker. Gets kind of pushed out with progressive reforms of Teddy Roosevelt. In fact, he and Teddy Roosevelt did not see eye to eye. William Randolph Hearst helps drive him out of office. And so he ends his career not as a senator, but rather as kind of a lawyer up in Ohio. So just kind of my little connection with U.S. history right there. Cuba, we have the Platt Amendment, 1901, that while it doesn't undo the Teller Amendment that guaranteed we would not annex Cuba, it basically says that we're kind of like their big brother. We get to intervene in Cuba if we think it's necessary. So while they're not necessarily our territory, we don't annex them, we don't control them, but we get to boss them around. Kind of. They can't make a treaty with another country without our approval. They can't do anything without our approval. This is part of how we end up with Guantanamo Bay, right? So just kind of keep in mind that this is part of the complicated relationship we have with Cuba. So we have such tight control in Cuba that this is what builds the resentment that leads to actually the rise of Castro and the overthrow of Batista in the 1950s. This cartoon shows kind of an embarrassed Uncle Sam with Colombia, and now look at this basket of babies left at his doorstep. Oh my goodness, what is he going to do? So I think that's kind of interesting. Kind of depicts kind of the anti-imperialist, what are we going to do with Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, and Cuba now that we've got them? Are we sure that we're ready for this? Are we prepared for it? So China, who had been carved up by European powers, and of course Japan had started to take a piece of China by 1895. The U.S. still wants to be sure that we have a foot in the door. And remember, we'd always been kind of struggling to keep that foot in the door. So in 1899, the U.S. basically, and part of the context of this are some political uprisings in China because the Chinese are pretty upset with how things are being run. Of course, you'd had Chinese immigration up until 1882 that had kind of created a pressure valve for people that were frustrated with China. But then in 1882, we shut that door. So all those people that are frustrated with China don't have anywhere to go. And so that creates political instability in China. And so they start kind of rising up. And Europe is threatening to come in and basically carve China up into little bitty pieces. And the U.S. steps in 1899 and say, whoa, wait a minute. We don't want, let's slow down. Let's keep an open door policy. Let's keep our spheres of influence. Let's have free trade, all this kind of stuff, and let's kind of encourage this. And so Europe kind of follows it along, and this will help the U.S. maintain its trade power in Asia. So the open door in China, in a sense, is a foreign policy win for the United States because it guarantees that the U.S. has this foot in the door. It kind of keeps China from disappearing as it existed for so many years. But it is a little bit unfair to China, and it's a little bit kind of cocky of the U.S. to suggest that they get to have any kind of say in China. So it's kind of I said it's a win, but it's kind of a win with an asterisk. And ultimately, part of the open door policy in China is that it begins to create this process of alliances and agreements to protect trade and markets. And these alliances are all well and good until about 1914, when they start to fall apart because of World War I. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. Panama had been under the control of Colombia, and the British and the French had tried to build a canal and failed miserably. Panama wants to be freed from Colombia, and the U.S. has come knocking at Colombia's door saying, hey, we'd like to buy Panama and build a canal across it. And basically, Colombia says, no way. And so Roosevelt begins to intentionally encourage this independence movement and essentially supports it by sending our Navy ships. And remember, we got a pretty bad Navy in 1903. And so we send the Navy over there, and we kind of help this independence movement and kind of force Colombia to agree to allow Panama to be an independent country. Colombia essentially says, hey, we don't want any piece of you. You just finished winning the Spanish-American War. We know how you've handled Cuba. So whatever, take Panama. And so the U.S. builds the canal across Panama. Very difficult conditions, lots of malaria, lots of yellow fever, major technological and construction advancements in this process of building the locks and all that kind of stuff. Learning that you can stop the spread of yellow fever and by controlling mosquito populations, that's a huge deal. So we've got medical advances in with this. So it's a pretty big deal as far as, what the U.S. can do. However, the U.S. blockade does create some resentment in Latin America and begins to kind of have a cooling effect on our relationship there that I think still holds true even today. This cartoon that Colombia's held up the wrong man. Basically, the assertion is that Colombia tried to strong-arm us into a deal, and Teddy Roosevelt stood up to them, right? I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. I don't know that Colombia was really trying to strong-arm us into anything. I think they just didn't want to participate, or they just didn't want to do it, and Teddy Roosevelt never took no for an answer. So this leads us into Roosevelt diplomacy. Namely the Roosevelt Corollary, 1904. Walk softly but carry a big stick. The concept is that the U.S. can go where it wants to preserve peace and preserve democracy and preserve its business interests. And, hey, whatever. We got a big military, and you don't want us to come use it. And so the U.S. kind of emerges as this policeman, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. But its idea is basically to preserve free trade, to preserve American business interests. And so that's primarily what it's used for. In the Dominican Republic, in the Caribbean, you see that kind of happening with Roosevelt diplomacy. And so this is a big deal for Roosevelt, this idea that the U.S. can go anywhere in the world with its military to protect its interests. The Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905, Teddy Roosevelt kind of inserts himself in the Russo-Japanese War. Japan was fighting over a particular island with Russia in 1905, and of course this tells you how quickly Japan had industrialized, that they were, capable from, 1855 to 1905 to launch an attack like this, and they basically kick Russia's butt. In fact, many argue that this is really the beginning of the end for the Tsar and for the Romanov dynasty, is that they can't win this Russo-Japanese war, because for the Russians, the idea that they would lose to the Japanese seems just absolutely incredible. And so they're fighting. Teddy Roosevelt inserts himself, negotiates an end, and he wins a Nobel Peace Prize for that. He also sends the Navy all around the world to show off how great our Navy is. This is has a lot to do with Japan, and kind of muscling Japan into playing nice with others, because he was a little bit concerned about Japan. He reaches a gentleman agreement with Japan over not sending too many immigrants to the U.S. So there's this weird kind of like respect, like this kind of head nod at each other, where we kind of understood the United States and Japan, like the concept of superiority, the concept of military strength and industrialization. We kind of grasped that, but at the same time, we didn't quite like each other. And so we were kind of frenemies, I guess you could say. And so this is part of what the Great White Fleet is meant to do, is kind of to remind Japan, okay, watch yourself. Don't make us come over there and use our Navy on you, because we can. So the Roosevelt Corollary is a big part of Roosevelt's foreign policy. And this one right here shows you him walking around with a big stick. This is a picture of the USS Texas and the Great White Fleet. I think the USS Texas is now in Galveston, in Houston, something like that. I think it's Galveston, and you can tour it. So this takes us from Roosevelt's main foreign policy emphasis to Taft. So, Roosevelt, while he's president, we start the Panama Canal, we have the Great White Fleet, open door policy with China. All this is well and good, right? And so Roosevelt's full of kind of bluster and big stick and all that kind of stuff. Well, when he leaves the office in 1908 and Taft comes in, Taft, not being the confrontational guy, right, he says, rather than focusing on the military, let's focus on economic investment. Remember his background with the Philippines, right? He saw what the military could do to an area, and so he doesn't really trust the military as kind of a force, as a peacekeeper. So he believes that the way to ensure kind of peace and stability in these developing countries is to have American investment. And so he encourages what we call dollar diplomacy. And that the U.S. needs to invest in Latin America and China and all over the Western Hemisphere. And the U.S. does. In fact, this is a big part of, U.S. investments in Mexico and all over Western Hemisphere. But the problem with this is the regimes in these countries are often very weak. They're very corrupt. These are developing countries that don't have the level of infrastructure that the United States has, and we know that the United States had its hands full with corruption. And so the U.S. has these corrupt regimes. You have people that are very frustrated with these regimes, and we don't really pay attention to the political circumstances. We just start sending our money in, and some of that money helps the wrong people. And so then when the workers rise up and they push back against the government turns to the U.S. and says, hey, you've got investment money here, come rescue it, right? And so the U.S. then becomes compelled to send its military in to back up its financial investments. And so this creates a ton of negativity about the United States. And so we'll see that the U.S. uses its military in 1912 and in 1911. And when Wilson becomes president, he very clearly says, okay, we're not going to do dollar diplomacy anymore. No more of this, right? We're not going to force other countries to do stuff they don't want to do. Remember, Wilson is the president of small government. Ha, 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 right? Not so small, but that's the idea. And so basically he sees the United States as kind of this moral leader in the world, that, okay, we're not going to lead with our military, we're not going to lead with our dollars, instead we're going to provide this moral example of democracy and freedom, and we're going to do it so well that everybody's going to want to be just like us. And he believes in competition and opening foreign markets, so he lowers the tariffs, right? And this kind of gives a money aspect to his morality. And he keeps, he says that, we're going to respect China. And we do kind of stay out of Chinese affairs under Wilson, but we see that with the Caribbean and Central America and even Mexico, it becomes much harder. These Caribbean countries, these Central American countries are very vulnerable, lots of turmoil, and every time things get really dicey, he ends up having to send in the military. So he ends up doing that a whole lot more than he would like to do. So again, think about Wilson and what he says when he runs for president and then how it ends up coming out. I just don't like the guy. I think he's so, his legacy is not a good one. So then we get to Mexico, and the United States under dollar diplomacy, and even a little bit before that, had heavily invested in Mexico thanks to the shared border, lots of railroad investment, lots of raw material excavation, that kind of thing. And so when Mexico has a revolution in 1910 due to massive corruption, the U.S. becomes very, very concerned. And there's a whole, it's more complicated in Mexico than I'm telling you, because there's government changes hands multiple times. It's a mess, right? And really what we need to concern ourselves with is, number one, you've got all this changing hands, and because you don't have a stable government, you have the emergence of kind of these gangs, right? These guys like Pancho Villa, Huerta. The best comparison I can make is think modern day cartels, right? Drug cartels. That's kind of what they are. And we have kind of a similar situation in Mexico now, where we've got a government that's kind of weak and has some corruption. And so in this power vacuum have stepped these cartels. Well, back then it was very much the same case, right? And so you get these what we call, jefe, big boss leaders that come in and dominate certain regions and basically have a de facto army, even though they're not really allied with the Mexican government, and they change alliances based on, I don't know, who they like best that day. And so Huerta comes in, and he's kind of known as a butcher. He kills his opponents. And he ends up emerging as the leader, although Wilson had preferred Carranza because he thought Carranza was more of a moderate. So then when Carranza, you go back and forth between Huerta and Carranza. Carranza refuses to allow the U.S. to dictate Mexican policy once he regains control over Huerta. And so the U.S. starts to get mad. And Pancho Villa, who doesn't like Carranza, and you've got all this, back and forth, right? So Pancho Villa is riding around northern Mexico, taking sides, causing havoc, destroying property, until all of a sudden he gets mad at the U.S., and next thing we know, he comes into New Mexico and murders some Americans in 1916. And the U.S. uses Pancho Villa as an excuse to send the army into Mexico. So we actually are in Mexico in 1916, 1917, and basically invade. What is it? Not Puerto Vallarta. Gosh, I'm blanking on the name of it. We invade one of their coastal cities, and we invade up to Mexico City, and basically strong arm Mexico. Get Pancho Villa, he loses his power, and this really sours our relationship with Mexico. You need to understand this part of it, because part of what sucks us into World War I is a little thing called the Zimmerman Telegram, which includes a promise by the German government to Mexico that they could regain the lost territories of New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. And to understand why the U.S. would buy that and why the U.S. would be so upset by that, you have to understand that the Americans were hanging out in Mexico in 1916, and that there were some bad feelings there. Otherwise, you think, well, why would the Germans promise this out of the clear blue? It's not out of the clear blue. This is kind of what's happening. This is a picture of Pancho Villa. So yeah, Mexican history is pretty fascinating during this time because there's so much turmoil. Mexican immigration into the U.S. begins in earnest about now because people wanted to escape the turmoil, and that this becomes really quite a big deal. So the impact of U.S. imperialism, regardless of who was president, progressive imperialism and diplomacy stressed moralism and order, championed the uplift of non-whites through racist attitudes, and strove to preserve a new frontier and economic opportunities related to it. So part of what we're doing with this is not only the idea that we can help other countries, that we have an obligation, right, kind of that social gospel kind of mentality, but also that we need a frontier, that without a frontier, what are we going to do? And so you have these concepts driving the U.S. to get involved. And so we're going to see that we really wrestle with this concept in the early 20th century. And it will be this that leads us into 1914, 1915, and kind of the second part of Wilson's presidency and how he tries to maintain neutrality going into World War I. So this is very, very quick kind of drive-by. I did not spend much time on the Panama Canal. I did not spend much, don't think I explained the Mexican conflict very well. That's a whole nother interesting side story. You've got Roosevelt. I just have barely touched on the policies of these progressive presidencies. This is a huge developmental time for the United States of America. And there's a whole lot that happens in this time period, and there's no way in the short amount of time that we have that I can even begin to cover all that happens. So kind of grasping these big concepts that I've introduced you to will help you understand some of our actions in World War I, some of the counter reactions in the 1920s and 1930s, and will kind of help you understand some of our debates about what are our obligations to the poor, how much government regulation is too much government regulation. All come back to this progressive period. So anyways, this one was a little bit shorter, I think only 50 minutes. So I hope it wasn't too bad. And anyways, we'll look at some documents in class.